They laughed when I said I was moving out with $500 in my pocket. "You'll come crawling back," they said. I didn't. Yesterday, I sent them my published book with a note. They laughed. That's what sticks with me most. Not the words, though those cut deep too, but the way they all burst out laughing like I just told the punchline to a really dumb joke. I stood at the end of the dinner table, holding my fork like a white flag, heart thudding in my chest. And they just laughed. "You'll come crawling back," Uncle Darren chortled between bites of overcooked turkey. "You'll be back in 2 weeks," my sister Kayla added, dabbing the corner of her smirking mouth with a napkin. Broken. Even Mom cracked a smile. The same Mom who used to kiss my forehead and call me her little dreamer now looked at me like I was a stray cat trying to join a dinner party. Dad didn't say anything at all. Just grunted and reached for the gravy. That was Thanksgiving 2 years ago. And that night was my final straw. I'd been the disappointment for as long as I could remember. The creative kid in a family of dentists, engineers, and insurance adjusters. They used to call me the romantic, but not in a sweet way, in the way people call a broken vending machine charming. I'd hop between dead-end jobs, barista, warehouse loader, once even a bellhop. Anything to keep my rent paid while I clung desperately to one dream, writing. They never got it. Not once. But I did. I got it. I understood it. I lived in it. Words were the only place I ever felt like I belonged. I'd spent that Thanksgiving quiet, chewing each bite like it might be my last. I already knew what I was going to say. Knew it days before. I just kept waiting for a window, for someone to ask how I was, for anyone to show a sliver of interest in what I wanted out of life. But no one did. They asked Kayla about her new condo. They asked my cousin Ben about his new internship at Google. They asked each other about market trends and mutual funds. So I cleared my throat and said it anyway. "I'm leaving," I told them. "For good. I've got $500, a laptop that barely works, and a story I need to write. I don't know where I'm going yet, but I know I won't be back." That's when they laughed. No one asked me why. No one asked what I'd be writing. They just laughed. My mother said, "Let him. He'll learn." My dad muttered, "Might finally knock some sense into him." Kayla shook her head, looking almost embarrassed to share DNA with me. And I smiled. Not because I was okay, but because I finally knew exactly what I needed to do. That night, I packed everything I owned into a duffel bag and a backpack. One held clothes, the other held my life, an old Toshiba laptop with a cracked corner, 2 notebooks filled with handwritten ideas, and a handful of printed rejection letters from the past 2 years, each one folded neatly like a scar I refused to hide. I checked my bank account before leaving. $517.46. That's what I had. That's what I was walking into the world with. My roommate at the time, Nate, watched me from the couch. "Dude," he said, rubbing the back of his neck, "are you sure about this?" "No," I said. "But I'm going anyway." He handed me a crumpled 20 from his wallet. "You'll need this more than I will." That was the first kindness I'd been shown in a long time. I took a bus out of town at 3:12 a.m. Didn't even know where I was going, just away. Away from the house where silence echoed louder than support. Away from the people who always looked at me like a bruised fruit at the bottom of the pile. The first week was the hardest. I stayed on an old friend's couch in Pittsburgh. Jake, a guy I hadn't seen since college but who welcomed me in like no time had passed. He worked nights, so we barely spoke, which suited me fine. I spent those nights on his torn leather sofa, the streetlight cutting stripes across the ceiling, writing until my fingers cramped. The story poured out of me in fragments. Characters with faces like my mother's, like Kayla's. A father figure with a permanent scowl. A protagonist who never spoke unless spoken to. I wasn't subtle. I wasn't trying to be. I just wrote. During the days I worked. First at a sandwich shop, then at a bookstore that barely stayed afloat. The hours were long, and the pay was pitiful, but it kept me fed and gave me just enough to stay afloat. Rejection emails continued to roll in. Not for us. Promising voice, but not quite the fit. Thank you, but no. Each one landed like a paper cut. Small, but sharp. Over time, I stopped checking my email daily. I just wrote. Because even if the world didn't want my words yet, they were still the only thing that made me feel alive. Every night, I'd sit with my laptop and open the same document, untitled Draft V18. And every night I'd whisper to myself, "They'll see. One day they'll see." Jake moved out 2 months later, new job in Atlanta. He offered to let me stay until the lease ran out, but I couldn't afford even half the rent on my own. I thanked him, shook his hand, and promised him I'd be okay. I wasn't. I bounced between couches after that. A coworker's basement. An old college friend's guest room. Sometimes I slept on buses just to stay warm. Pittsburgh winters don't care about your dreams. They bite at your fingers when you're typing and steal your breath when you're walking the streets at 2 a.m. wondering if you made a mistake. I still wrote. Not because I was inspired, but because not writing felt worse. Writing was the only part of the day where I didn't feel like a failure. It was my rebellion. My refuge. My revenge. The novel slowly became less of a story and more of a confession. It wasn't fiction anymore, not really. The main character, Aaron, was me in everything but name. The villain? A composite of everyone who'd ever said I was wasting my time. Everyone who laughed. Everyone who told me to get real. I remember the night I finished the first full draft. It was raining. I was in a 24-hour laundromat with free Wi-Fi, my laptop balancing on a dryer. I clicked save, stared at the word count, 104,398, and felt this strange mixture of exhaustion and hope. I had written the truth. My truth. Now came the part one hated more than anything, letting the world see it. I sent it out to agents. To small publishers. To anyone with an open submissions page and a shred of credibility. And for a long time, nothing. Then, one morning, mid-February I think, I got an email. The subject line read, Re-submission. Ashes and Atlas. I almost didn't open it. I expected another polite no. Instead I saw, "We read your manuscript and couldn't stop. It's raw. It's devastating. It's honest. We'd love to talk more." It wasn't a huge publisher. Just a small indie press out of Chicago run by two sisters who had once been writers themselves. But to me, they were giants. They offered a modest advance, a team of editors, and more than anything, belief. And for the first time in my life, someone believed in me without a but. The edits took 3 months. They weren't easy. Turns out I'd written entire chapters in emotional shorthand, scenes that only made sense if you knew the pain behind them. But the editors were patient. They didn't just clean up my grammar, they asked the hard questions. Why does Aaron stay quiet in Chapter 7? What happened in the kitchen that night? I told them. And then I wrote it. Each rewrite peeled me back a little more. It hurt, honestly, it felt like tearing open a healed wound and poking around inside. But the more I wrote, the more I realized I wasn't just telling my story. I was telling our story. For everyone who ever sat through a dinner where the only thing served with the mashed potatoes was condescension. When the final draft was locked in, the publisher scheduled a release for late fall, just before Thanksgiving. Ironic, I thought. Fitting, even. They sent early copies out to reviewers, and I braced myself for apathy. I imagined maybe 1 or 2 sympathetic blurbs. Maybe. Instead, something strange happened. A week before the release date, one review dropped. Then another. And another. Not just positive, they were emphatic. Unflinching, one called it. A brutal portrait of conditional love. Necessary reading, wrote another. Word spread. The first printing sold out in a week. Then the second. Then they announced a third run before Christmas. Bookstores started placing the novel in their spotlight sections. One day I walked into a tiny shop in Boston, and there it was, facing outward on a shelf, the title bold against the backdrop of spines too polite to stand out. Ashes and Atlas? It didn't make me rich overnight. I didn't buy a mansion or a sports car. But it gave me something I'd never had before: security. And a voice. I moved into a studio apartment downtown. Nothing flashy. Concrete walls, wide windows, quiet. I bought myself a real desk. Set up a little writing corner with plants and sticky notes, and a used lamp I found on Facebook Marketplace. The only decoration was a framed copy of the first review I ever got. And then, one morning, I woke up and knew. It was time. Time to send the book to the people who told me I'd never write anything worth reading. Who laughed when I stood up for myself. Time for them to read the story they unknowingly starred in. I mailed the books one by one. No fancy packaging. Just paperback copies, placed carefully in plain brown envelopes. Each with a handwritten note inside the front cover. I took my time writing those notes, kept them short but sharp. No need for essays. Just enough to make the message clear. To my father I wrote, "Thought you'd enjoy the story. Especially the parts where you inspired the villain." To my mother, "Hope this helps you remember what silence sounds like from the other side." To Kayla, my sister, hers took me the longest. Not because I didn't know what to say, but because I had too much I could say. In the end, I kept it simple. Chapter 14. You're welcome. I smiled when I sealed that one. Chapter 14 was the hardest chapter I'd ever written. It was where Aaron, the character based on me, finally saw his sister for what she was. Not cruel in a cartoon villain way. Just cold. Thoughtless. The kind of person who hurts you by pretending nothing ever happened. In that chapter, Aaron doesn't scream. He doesn't beg for understanding. He just walks out, and never looks back. That was the moment my editor circled and said, "This is the emotional core of your book." Funny. It was also the chapter one wrote while sitting on a stranger's couch, in a city I didn't know, eating instant ramen and wondering if I'd made the biggest mistake of my life. I dropped the packages in the mailbox on a gray Tuesday morning. No tracking numbers. No return address. Just trust in gravity and poetic justice. Then I went home, made coffee, sat by the window, and waited, not for replies, but for the silence that would inevitably follow. The first day after the packages were delivered, I heard nothing. No calls. No texts. Not even a stray passive-aggressive email. I refreshed my inbox more times than I'd like to admit, not because I wanted to hear from them, but because some part of me was still that kid, standing outside his own house, hoping someone would open the door and say, "Come back in. We're sorry." But no door opened. Just like it hadn't back then. Day 2? Still nothing. Day 3? The silence thickened, like fog rolling in around my apartment. Heavy. Muted. But strangely peaceful. I'd expected rage, maybe even threats. I imagined my mother calling to accuse me of airing family business in public. I imagined my father's voice, tight and mean, saying something like, "So now you're a big-shot author? Don't forget where you came from." But none of it came. I opened my copy of the book, flipped through the pages, and landed, almost like fate, on Chapter 6. The confrontation scene. Aaron telling his family he's leaving. Telling them they don't own him anymore. That he's done trying to win a game where the rules were never made for him to win. When I wrote that scene, I cried. I didn't even realize it at first. Just tears on the keyboard, quietly appearing as I typed, because it wasn't fiction. It was a memory I never got to finish. A version of me that finally said what real me couldn't. By the end of the week, I knew they'd all read it. Even if they didn't finish the book, they read the parts about them. They would have gone straight to the chapters that had their fingerprints all over them. And they would have recognized themselves, not just from the events, but from the feeling. From the coldness of the mother character. The dismissiveness of the father. The scornful sister who only ever laughed when the main character cried. I had named none of them. But they were all right there. Immortalized. And the best part? I never had to defend myself. I didn't have to explain the years of condescension, the emotional absence, the way they dismissed my dream as a childish phase. I had done something far better. I told the truth, and let them sit in it. It was the kind of revenge that doesn't come with fireworks or shouting matches. Just a book on a table. A quiet story that refuses to stay quiet. It's a strange thing, to get exactly what you wanted, and feel a kind of peace you didn't expect. I kept waiting for the crash. For someone to knock on my door, maybe my father in a rare show of theatrical anger, slamming a copy of Ashes and Atlas onto my desk and barking something like, "This is slander!" Or for my sister to go online and air out her grievances in one of her infamous Notes app rants. But the silence held. Not empty, not passive, deliberate. Like they were choosing not to respond. And that made it even better. Because in their world, silence was always a weapon. Growing up, silence meant punishment. It meant disappointment. It meant, "We're not mad, just ashamed." But now, that silence didn't feel like punishment. It felt like acknowledgement. They had nothing to say because they couldn't deny it. Maybe that was the best revenge of all. I'd walk past bookstores and see my novel in the window, sometimes next to authors I used to worship from afar. People would tag me in posts on social media, holding their copies, underlining paragraphs I wrote in the dead of night when I didn't think anyone would ever read them. Lines like, "He wasn't born angry. He was made that way, polished by shame, sharpened by mockery." Or, "The hardest part of growing up in a house without love is realizing the echo you've mistaken for affection was just your own voice coming back to you." That one got quoted a lot. It still gives me chills. Because I wrote it sitting on a mattress on the floor of a friend's spare room, my laptop propped on an upside-down laundry basket. That line had come to me so fast, I barely typed it in time. And yet now, here it was, on mugs, on bookmarks, tattooed on someone's ribcage. The emails I did get were from strangers. Messages that began with, "I thought I was the only one," and ended with, "Thank you for telling my story too." One woman wrote to me about her father, how he told her she'd never make it as an artist and that she should get a real job. She said she hadn't picked up a paintbrush in 5 years, until she read my book. She attached a picture of a half-finished painting. I kept it. There was a kid who wrote from Idaho. 17. Said my book helped him realize that leaving doesn't make you weak. Staying does. He said he was applying to colleges out of state, first in his family. I wrote back to every single one of them. Not because I felt like an author, but because I knew what it felt like to scream into the void and hear nothing back. I wanted them to know their voices mattered. That they weren't alone. In a strange way, I had built a family from the fragments of the one I lost. Not bound by blood, but by story. By truth. By survival. And through all this, still nothing from my real family. No calls. No texts. No doorstep confrontations. They didn't even try to deny it. And that silence? That silence was finally mine. I never really planned Chapter 14. It wasn't on any outline. I didn't write it with vengeance in mind, or with Kayla specifically as the target. But when I sat down that night and let my fingers move, it spilled out like it had been waiting years to be written. Aaron walks into his sister's new condo, a pristine, glass and marble thing she never lets him forget she earned. All by herself. She's hosting a party, full of sleek people with expensive watches and even more expensive opinions. He's there by obligation. That's what she tells him anyway. Obligation. The chapter starts quiet. Everyone talking over him. Wine being poured. Someone laughing at a joke he didn't hear. And then she brings him up. Not directly, of course, she's too polished for that. No, she tells a story. One of those funny family stories. That isn't funny at all. About how Aaron used to write poems in high school. How their dad used to say, "Maybe one day you'll write a check that doesn't bounce." The room laughs. Aaron doesn't. He just stands there, holding a drink he doesn't want, and realizes, for the first time, that he's not embarrassed. Not anymore. He's angry. The words come out of him with terrifying calm. He doesn't raise his voice. He doesn't throw his glass. He just says the thing he never got to say. "It must be so easy for you, Kay. To forget what you stepped on to get here. You wore my shame like an accessory. You laughed at me so you wouldn't be mistaken for me. And now you tell my story like it's a joke, because the truth makes you too uncomfortable. The chapter ends with him walking out of the condo, the laughter gone. Her voice chasing him down the hall, for once unsure. And he doesn't look back. When my editor read it, she sent me a one-line email. I don't know who she is in real life, but I hope she reads this. She did. I know because a week after the book launched, I saw Kayla's name in my email inbox. I stared at it for 5 minutes. Didn't open it. Didn't need to. She hadn't called. Hadn't left a voicemail. Just this one cold, cautious message with a subject line that simply read, "Read your book." No body text. No signature. And that told me everything I needed to know. She saw herself. She recognized the mirror. And she didn't like what looked back. But she couldn't say it wasn't true. I didn't reply to Kayla's email. Not because I didn't have anything to say, trust me, I did, but because anything I could say would only lessen it. The book was my reply. My answer. My line in the sand. And besides, silence had always been their preferred language. I was just finally fluent. The next few weeks passed like walking through fog you knew well. Familiar quiet, familiar shadows. I checked my phone out of habit sometimes, sure. Some old muscle memory hoping for something, anything, that felt like remorse. But nothing came. And honestly, I didn't need it anymore. What was I hoping for anyway? An apology from my father that would never come? A tearful voicemail from my mother about how proud she suddenly was? For Kayla to own up to what she'd done, not just the jabs and the laughter, but the years of treating me like a speed bump in her personal success story? No. That's not how these people worked. They didn't apologize. They adjusted. They rewrote history in their heads to make themselves the victim. I could already hear them at the next holiday dinner. He twisted everything. He always was dramatic. We were just trying to help him grow up. That was fine. Let them spin their stories. I had already published mine. A friend texted me a photo from the airport a few days later. My book, my story, was in one of those top reads this month displays right next to the big names I used to shelve when I worked late night at the bookstore. I zoomed in, just to make sure it was real. It was. No one in my family sent a message about that. No. Hey, saw your book in the store. No. Congrats. They didn't even pretend to care. But that's what made it perfect. Because this wasn't for them anymore. It never really was. This was for the version of me that used to stay up until 3 a.m. whispering ideas into the dark, hoping they meant something. For the kid who wrote stories in secret because he was too scared to share anything out loud. For the man who walked out of a family dinner with $500 and a dream nobody believed in. He made it. He didn't crawl back. He didn't break. And he didn't need a single "I'm sorry" to win.